Welcome to the By Way of Commandment podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the finer points of his doctrine. Join us as we study the gospel through the scriptures and standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I want to kind of go back to the root and branch for a minute, because I just remembered you guys brought up a couple examples in your discussion, you and Todd, in your discussion on this. And what I thought was so funny and what I geeked out over a little bit is when you mentioned Star Wars as being kind of an example, a modern day example of what it means to kind of lose your way and cut yourself off from the true root. I don't know if you want to get into that a little bit and kind of use that
Sure,
example.
yeah.
But I couldn't stop thinking about that. The first time I listened to that episode a few weeks ago, I immediately had a number of things related to Star Wars that I was like, well, this applies to this and this applies to that. Um, so so in our own modern society, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do the nerdy thing. Using Star Wars as a perfect example. How do you see uh Star Wars in the modern era as being an archetype or fulfilling some of these patterns of what it means to either be grafted in and remain true to the pure root, or cutting yourself off from it?
Yeah. Well, so there are definitely some examples even within the story that I think, you could look at. And um I'm what I'll probably do, and maybe we can dive into some of those in a minute, but what I'll probably do just to start, and this is what we talk about in the video, is at like a meta level, at a storytelling level, we'll just say, um, the spirit in which Star Wars was originally delivered uh hit on a lot of sort of deep archetypes that just resonate with people on a very spiritual level, whether or not they necessarily realize it. And that's what makes the story so powerful. And like has happened to so many things that corporate media gets a hold of. Um, we talked about what happened to Star Wars since Disney purchased it. Uh,
Yeah.
it started to become more about a money grab and pushing a certain agenda than it was telling the story of Star Wars, right? And so a lot of the writers have started to really drift from the spirit in which George Lucas originally presented the story, right? And as they do that, in an effort to tell their own story and not to continue forward the story that was sort of already there, the spirit of that story, um, you got people that they just hate it now, right? The fan base is like, this is completely different. And the thing that's motivating it at the end of the day is money and their own ideology. But we use that as like a perfect example of what it means to get away from your founding spirit. And the result that sort of ensues as a consequence.
um Man, are you watching any of the newer Star Wars stuff, like some of the shows on
Yeah,
Disney Plus?
unfortunately.
Did you watch like Ahsoka and
Uh-huh.
the Acolyte and stuff like that?
Uh-huh.
Okay, man. Okay, for the audience, I apologize. This is going to be really nerdy and all Star Wars. I promise it's related to this concept of the spirit of Elijah and the roots and vines and branches. But if anybody is like, I'm bowing out, I'm tapping out, I won't feel bad. Or I won't feel bad if somebody decides to bow out of the conversation at this point. Um, so man, the original trilogy still stands today, I think, in the minds of most fans as the best of the trilogies. Right? We've had the original trilogy that came out in the 70s and 80s. We had the prequels, which when they came out, people saw as kind of like an abomination of sorts, or tarnishing the legacy of the original trilogy. And now that we have Disney and the sequel trilogy, a lot of people have kind of um, backpedaled a little bit on the prequels and said, well, those weren't that bad. And I actually really like the prequels for a number of reasons. If not for anything else, other than the archetypes of these characters are fleshed out or done pretty well in the prequels. But something that is so frustrating to a lot of fans today is the fact that, like you said, most of the stuff being made today under the Disney banner of Star Wars just feels like a money grab and devoid of the heart and spirit of the original trilogy, the original story that George made. Um, and it's because I think it's we can see pretty clearly the the cogs turning, the wheels turning in the Disney machine of let's pump out more and more and more. This will make us a lot of money, and they've prioritized quantity of projects over quality. And we have a number of examples of directors and writers who aren't very familiar with or don't care about upholding the legacy of what Star Wars means to the fans, let alone to George Lucas as he originally intended. And they just want to tell new stories. Which is fine. You can tell new stories, but when you insert uh, some ideology that is completely at odds with the spirit of the franchise meant to its creator and its fans, then it's now something else entirely. And because it's under the Star Wars banner and it's meant to be seen as congruent with all the other things that came before it, and we see such a clear disconnect between the spirit and mission of these different stories that are at odds with each other, it's jarring and it's noticeable.
It
Um,
loses its identity ultimately. It's
right.
because it's confused about what it is. And this, by the way, is the Whore of Babylon, right? Um, it's a million things. It's indiscriminate about what it embodies.
Yeah. But one of the examples that came up in my mind with regards to this is I remember seeing The Last Jedi, which is Rian Johnson's uh, Star Wars film, episode 8, and being so upset at what they did to the character of Luke Skywalker and how they turned him into this like grumpy old curmudgeon who cut himself off from the Force and from the world entirely. He wasn't even in contact with his friends, and he basically just went off to an island somewhere to live out the rest of his days and die. Um, and didn't want to be a part of the fight, didn't want to be a part of the solution and come back and help. And I saw what they did with that character, and I was immediately disappointed in how they played that out. Um, and I felt like the whole film as a whole was a message to the fan base, intentionally or otherwise, that from here on out, we're going to subvert everything that you thought you loved about Star Wars, everything that made the original story what it was. We're going to subvert all that. Your heroes are now the bad guys. They're the ones that messed up, and everything was ruined because of them. Luke's not a hero anymore. He tried to kill his nephew, which is completely antithetical to who Luke was at the end of uh, Return of the Jedi, which, by the way, is my favorite Star Wars film. I don't care. I will fight anybody. I recognize that most people will say it's Empire, but I hold that Return of the Jedi is the best of the three. But it's because, and I couldn't articulate this as a kid, but something that struck me that was so powerful in the story is the whole story of A New Hope and into Empire Strikes Back is he has to he has to learn his identity. He has to learn where he came from and the legacy that he belongs to and be grafted in with the help of his friends and particularly with the help of Obi-Wan and Yoda training him and helping him to be grafted back into the source of where he came from so that he could be the hero that the universe needs him to be to help defeat the evil and that the evil that's embodied in the empire, in the emperor, all of that. And we learn in the first film Darth Vader is kind of the big bad. We learn in the second film that he's really working with the emperor. um and so Luke has been training this whole time, the first two films. He needs to face the evil. He needs to face Vader and defeat him. You have to destroy the evil. um and so that's what he's training for. But then when he's confronted with the evil, something is revealed about himself. Um, and he obviously one of the biggest twists in cinema history. Spoiler alert for anybody who's not seen it. Uh, Darth Vader is Luke's father, right? Um, that adds a whole layer of drama to the film, to the story. But this became, to me, the anchor point of why Return of the Jedi is so important in the trilogy, because this whole time he's been trained to defeat Vader as the kind of embodiment of the evil, and that if he can overcome and defeat Vader, then they can defeat the Empire and have peace in the galaxy again. So he's been taught you have to fight Vader. Even the beginning of Return of the Jedi, when he goes back to see Yoda and Yoda dies, he tells him you have to confront Vader. You have to defeat Vader, right? This is the only way. But when you get to the end of the film, the end of the trilogy, this is what makes Luke such a great character, such a great archetype, and why I think this is so applicable to this discussion about roots and branches.
Yeah, it's redeeming the
When
dead, right? This is the
he's redeeming the dead, right? So in order to he's fighting his father at the end. He's fighting Vader, and he gets to the point where he realizes I've overpowered him. I could take his life right now if I wanted to. I could destroy Vader right now, and I've won. Um, but he doesn't. In his humanity and his mercy, he throws away his weapon, his weapon of war. He buries his weapon of war, and he says, "No, I'm going to save my father. I'm not going to destroy him. I'm going to save him." And obviously, what happens next? The Emperor turns on Luke and starts to kill him. And as he's doing so, Vader destroys the Emperor. And so Luke's sacrifice of himself, knowing full well that if he throws away his weapon, Vader and the Emperor could destroy him. His sacrifice redeems his father, and as he redeems his father saves him. And that's how evil was destroyed. That's how the Emperor was destroyed. It's not because Luke destroyed the evil and became a branch or root unto himself. It's because he turned back and said, "No, the true way is to redeem my father, to redeem the dead, to look back to the fathers and to what they are supposed to be, and to redeem them. And as I do so, they redeem me. They without us, and we without them," as Hebrews 11 says. And that's how the Emperor and the Empire is destroyed. That's what made that. I could never articulate that as a kid, but that was so powerful, and that was the reason why that was my favorite film. And so when you guys brought up Star Wars in your discussion briefly, that's the image that immediately went to my mind, is like this is a modern pop archetypal version of everything that you just discussed.
Mm.
Um, and why the sequel trilogy seemingly undid all of that and said, no, none of that mattered. That was all, uh, that's all wrong. We're going to subvert it and give you a different version
It's,
of what you think you knew.
yeah, and it's so funny because it's like it happens on like this sort of meta level, like man, because the spirit of the original story is what you're describing, and the story they tell ends up being the very thing that they're actually doing to Star Wars,
Right.
right? We're going to move away from the root here, and we're going to, we're going to be a branch unto ourselves, a root unto ourselves, and sort of just brush everything that came before aside.
And even in that film, in episode 8, it's even stated by the characters, um halfway through the film, when Ray and Kylo Ren kind of team up to take out the royal guard and whatever, and then they're um struggling for a minute, and he's like, quit holding on, you have to let go, you have to let go of the past, destroy it, burn it all down, let go, and let's go off and do something new. uh and in a weird meta kind of way, that's exactly what the film was doing, even though it's coming out of the mouth of the villain of the film. um but it's a weird ironic meta way, like you said, of the film coming right out and stating, this is how we feel about the legacy, you have to burn it all down, and we're going to start over and make something new.
What's he
um
say? Exactly. It's like let go of the past, kill it if you have to, or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I just immediately, like, in the theater, I was like, ugh, that's what this film just referenced itself, what it's
Yeah.
doing to the overarching story. um
There's the spirit of the Antichrist for you.
right. um and this plays again, so I see this again in Ahsoka that came out last year, maybe last year, I don't know.
That's
um
right.
did you watch all of Ahsoka?
Mhm.
So halfway through the season, um they're Ahsoka and Sabine are on their way tracking down, um I can't remember her name now, the witch lady. I don't
Yeah, I
know.
don't know.
And then the two rogue Jedi, like they're not Sith, but they're whatever you want to call them, that are helping her. They track them down. They find the planet that they're on, where they're taking the map to get the coordinates to go find Thrawn. And they have this whole episode that's just a battle between Ahsoka and Sabine versus the other two, right? Um, and they're fighting and all this stuff, and then Sabine gets held up, and so Ahsoka moves on to fight, um, whatever his name is. Um, was it Ray Stevens' character? Um, and they're fighting between these pillars on this cliffside, right, overlooking the ocean. Um, and they have this fight, and then eventually the episode ends. Spoiler alert. With Ahsoka being kicked over the side of the cliff. Um, and so the assumption made by the other characters is she's dead. Um, Leading up to this, the whole 4 or 5 episodes that have led up to this point, Ahsoka is kind of going through the motions. She knows what she has to do, but is just kind of going through the motions. And she and Sabine have this like internal tension of they can't really trust each other, because Ahsoka doesn't really trust that Sabine uh, is going to do what's necessary for them to stop the bad guys from completing their goal, because she's just worried about getting Ezra back, right? And I know we've lost all of listeners to the podcast at this point. Um, that's okay. But anyway, so the whole time leading up to this big fight, there's tension and disagreement and distrust between Ahsoka and Sabine. Um, and they're just not on the same page, and they have different goals. They're not united, and Ahsoka seems to be giving up. Like she just feels kind of like um, everything she's done to this point, everything she's doing is ultimately going to be for nothing, or they're not going to succeed. And so, what's the point, right? And then she has this fight. She gets kicked off the cliff, and you assume that, or the characters assume that she's dead, and then that's the episode. Then the next episode, most of the episode, she's in the world between worlds, and she's being trained by Anakin, right? Which has to me some of the best uh, lore in Star Wars that we've seen from Disney in a while. But this is why I can tell Dave Filoni was in charge of this project is because of that episode. Not just because it's Ahsoka and Ahsoka was the character he created for Clone Wars, but um, because of the way that episode is written, and the way they address some of her issues and what's happening in the narrative. Um, because as she's in the world between worlds and she's speaking with slash fighting Anakin, Anakin says like I'm here to complete your training. I'm here to tell you or to train you and teach you the thing that you are lacking, right? The thing that you haven't received. And she's like, there's nothing really you can teach me. Um, Whatever. And they have this whole episode of like him teaching her by putting her back into different periods of time throughout the Clone Wars, back when they were together fighting the Clone Wars and having these mentor apprentice interactions, right? The the scene towards the end of that sequence where it's young Ahsoka and a younger Anakin in fighting in the Clone Wars, and he comes to see her because it's the fight on Mandalore, which Anakin wasn't there for, but she's kind of a grown up or an older version of Ahsoka fighting. In any case, when he shows up and they have their little chat, um, she kind of reveals that her hesitation and why she can't come to terms with what she has to do now in the real world to achieve their goal and to stop the bad guys and to um, do all that is she feels like her part in the legacy of Jedi is broken, and that she came from Anakin, who became Vader, who broke that chain, and all that's left is a legacy of death and destruction. Um, and so the lesson she has to learn is, do you, well, the way it's put in the show is live or die, right? Are you going to live and fight, put up the good fight, and maintain your course of action to do the right thing, or are you going to keel over and die and just let evil win? Um, but the message is, at least from what I can tell in a more gospel centric lens, is, are you going to mend the broken branch and regraft into the true vine? Or are you going to continue in your path of being a broken branch and die? Um, and part of the at least for me, part of the message that comes across in the way that the show is manifest is, by the end of their interaction towards the end of the episode, uh, she's healed something in her through her conversation and interactions with this version of Anakin, where um, she realizes that she can be a healer in this uh, in this chain, this broken chain or legacy of the Jedi, right? And what the Jedi really are meant to be and what they really stand for at its core. Um, she can be one to heal that if she just gets up and fights and chooses to live and move forward to help defeat the evil, right? And so when she's made that decision, she's chosen to live, then she's no longer in the world between worlds anymore. Now it shows her uh, in the ocean off the side of the cliff, and she's floating there in the water, and she's Hera and the others had swooped down, and they pick her up out of the water, and they get her. And when she comes to, when she wakes up, she puts on her white robes. Right, she's wearing gray this whole time through the series, but then she has this death in the world between worlds where she has to learn the lesson so that she can be resurrected, and she's baptized in the water, pulled out of the water, and then puts on the white robes, and now she's resurrected, so to speak. She's like Gandalf the White, right?
Mm.
This theme hit me so powerfully in those two episodes back to back that I'm like, this was written by somebody who understands the spirit of Star Wars and the archetype of what the story is meant to be. Um, that was a really lengthy, nerdy.
Amazing how, yeah, you see these truths echo out, everywhere. And even when, someone is trying to like be deviant from the story, they can't help but tell the story in their own way, right? They're just
Yeah,
telling a different part.
yeah.
Uh,
It was amazing. The first time I watched those episodes, I was like, clear as day. This is death, resurrection,
mhm.
rebirth, resurrection. This is baptism, putting on the new garment. Um, this is this is Star Wars. Like that. That to me was like that's the true principle coming out in this form of media that we sit down on a couch and watch. But there's true principles being taught here that relate to the gospel of Christ that I found really interesting. Um, and I apologize to all the listeners who have left by now um, because that
I wouldn't be
was,
here for your apology.
well, that's true. So I'll apologize in advance, and I'll just clip that at the beginning of the conversation. But
Uh,
um, yeah, no, I this whole conversation about roots and branches has been um, has allowed me to kind of think back to things like Star Wars or things like other things in my life or whatever, and you can kind of pull out and see different versions of how this plays out in your own life and in media and the books we read and the shows we watch um and like you said, like there's also the antichrist idea, right, of like stop holding on to the past, kill it, burn it down if you have to, destroy it, and move on and become a new thing, and um, cut yourself off from the root and become your own root, um, which we know is impossible. A branch that's cut off from the root that withers and dies. Um, but you see the same imagery and the same ideas pop up all over the place. Um, that's a fantastic analogy for describing this whole conversation.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, and for those listening, now that you've kind of heard the pattern, um, this is something that you'll see manifest everywhere, if you kind of keep an eye out for it. Um, all good stories and bad stories are they're both telling this pattern in some way or other, right? They're either highlighting the positive side or the negative side. So it's
Yeah,
one story, right? It's one unified priesthood. It all comes together in one in Christ.
Right. So one of the things that I find interesting about the I guess the priesthood side of the discussion, right? The sealing keys of the priesthood as restored by Elijah is this discussion of what sealing looks like, how it's performed in its ritual form here on earth, and then what that looks like beyond our mortal lives, right? And we have I think we talk about sealing in terms of like marriage, right? We're sealed to our spouse in the temple. When we have children that are uh, brought up in in the gospel or whatever, they're sealed to us by virtue of us having been sealed together. Um, things like that. But I find that to be just a part of the equation. That's not the whole. That doesn't explain the whole um, concept of the sealing power, the sealing keys, right? It's much bigger than that. And I've had conversations with Todd in the past, like I mentioned. We had a lengthy conversation about this quite a while ago. Um, but the just men made perfect is a title in the Doctrine and Covenants that is used to denote people who are essentially have reached their exaltation, right, or have received their exaltation, um, or an exaltation, right? Um, and something that I found really interesting, and maybe you can help me with this, um, is how those on the other side of the veil help us in this process of maintaining the covenant. Let's say whether that's the overarching covenant, the covenant of Christ being His, the Abrahamic covenant, whatever you want to call it. Um, do you have thoughts on like how those on the other side of the veil reciprocate and help us? Because we do temple work for our ancestors all the time, genealogy work. We take these names of our ancestors to do to perform ordinances for them so that they can accept them if they want on the other side. But there seems to be in scripture an idea that it's a reciprocal relationship. It's not just a one way, we're doing all this for them. There seems to be something reciprocated to us as well.
Yeah, I think the um, probably the best way to think about this, you might start with the Star Wars as an analogy here for it. Um, Luke connects up to those that are in a redeemed association in order to grow in the Force so that he can turn and redeem his father. So there's a difference between being in association with the fathers, the covenant fathers, and then extending life-giving redemption to your fathers, right, to your dead. Um, and it begins with the fathers, uh, the same way that we love God because He loved us first, right? Um, the father-son, the father-child relationship always begins with on the part of the parent, on the initiative of the parent who reaches out, and then it's the child who reaches back in return, and that's what brings them together. I'll give me just a second. My camera's there we go. So in order to, well, okay, let me back up. The question was, what role do they play? Why is it that we without them cannot be made perfect? Well, this goes back to kind of what we talked about previously, which is all of those fathers in heaven have a dispensation um, and a family and a ministry by covenant that they continue to act in now that they've moved out of this world. Um, the ministry of angels. So we'll go to Moroni 7. Actually, I won't pull it up just for brevity's sake, but the ministry of angels, they do the work of the covenants of the Father, right? Um, all all ministry is a covenant matter. It's a covenant obligation ultimately, and it's a family matter and a family obligation. And so um, the work over one's posterity is the exact same, right? It's carried out by angels that have a covenant invest, that's what I'm looking for, investment in the welfare of their posterity. And so, I mean, all the work that heaven is engaged in, the work of the ministry of angels to unseen and seen do everything that they do and to move all the pieces in the right place to make happen what it does. Even to, carrying revelation to you. We read in D&C 76 and in 2nd Nephi 32 that angels are the ones who deliver the Holy Ghost. And what's the Holy Ghost? In Lectures on Faith, we read that the Holy Ghost is the mind of God. It's that shared oneness that is had between the Father and the Son. That essence is the Holy Ghost. And like we talked about earlier, is there's one God and many gods. They all share in that in a portion, right? Or to some degree, that same mind. That's how and why they're one. And so anytime revelation comes to you, or anytime you're guided or prompted to do something that comes down from heaven, from above, that's coming down through a familial line. That's coming down through angels who have a covenant uh, interest in your well-being and in the well-being of your posterity, right? Because your posterity or their posterity. So, I mean, in short, it's everything that heaven is doing, uh, and preparing and leading and guiding and inspiring the whisperings of the Holy Ghost. Um, those all echo from the same source, and they're passed down through this network of light bearers in God's family.
Yeah, we kind of started the conversation talking about the idea or the competing ideas of how and where religion started and was disseminated, and how ultimately I believe there was kind of uh, one true religion or something kind of given to humanity, that in turn was disseminated and divided between the posterity of the children of men. Um, One thing that I find interesting about a number of different cultures throughout history is how they treat or revere their ancestors. And there's a lot of cultures that have even celebrations for their ancestors. Um, and this even comes up in the ancient Near East as well. But I think some modern examples, um, we have Dia de Muertos, and we have, um, the Eastern cultures and Eastern religions have an idea of uh, your ancestors watching over you, and you bring honor to your ancestors, or shame to your ancestors, the shame to the family name, or glory to the family name, depending upon how you live, right? And um, even in kind of Western culture, we have an idea of like guardian angels, and there's a very strong connection of the concept of a guardian angel with our deceased loved ones. Um, and I feel like this is one of those concepts that was original to the gospel, or to the original religion or culture that was given to man. Is this idea that those who died before you, those who came before you, have a part to play in your life, and the way that you live honors them, or not. Um, but there's a connection there, and that life doesn't end after death, even if you take the idea that there is no actual life after death, but they live on in spirit or in idea or ideal, the way you live your life. Even in that, there's still this idea that those who came before you are watching over you or have a part to play in your life, depending upon how you live. So this is something that I find interesting.
Yeah, at the very least, just by virtue of what you have, right?
Yeah,
I think the first step is recognizing all that you've been given and recognizing that, yeah, the gifts that you've been given that you of yourself did nothing to and could never um, merit in a vacuum, right?
yeah, and even this goes even farther in some cultures where it's like, if you don't have some token or some memory or something to remember, to remember your deceased loved one by, and you forget about them, then it's almost like they cease to exist on the other side.
Yeah, I didn't know about that until I watched Coco.
Yeah, that's a perfect
That's great.
example. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so there's a idea in the ancient Near East that's very similar, um, where it's like if you that's what this is one of the reasons why genealogy is so important in the ancient Near East and why a lot of um, authors of a number of religious texts in the ancient Near East would include genealogies of people is they don't want to forget their ancestors and where they came from, because they believe that they still had a part to play in their life, and that if they forgot about them, then they wouldn't be able to help them.
Yeah.
If you forget
That's
about your
yeah.
ancestors, then they can't help you. They can't be
Yeah,
there for you.
it's you see it's such a core part of their identity, who they are. And you see in the Book of Mormon too, like people show up and they announce who they are by citing their genealogy like 8 generations back or however. There's something about that too. I'll just say maybe as we're kind of wrapping up here, there's something about the the power of that like I mean it's psychologists even recognize that it is great for mental health to have something of an intergenerational self, right? To have a context of like what your roots are, who you are, where you come from. Um, they've done studies with the particular one I heard about was kind of talking to kids pre and post 9/11 that they had happened to do kind of a longitudinal study with. And those that had a sense for their ancestry they had more confidence. They were, I mean, you can really think of it being like they were better rooted. So they had a stronger foundation, right? They could withstand the wind as a result. And I mean, we see it in lifetime what kind of effect that has. And
Yeah,
so the spirit of this is exactly how far can you go with that? And the answer is all the way to the top.
yeah, all the way back. Um, man, um, so you've dropped one video on your channel so far. Um, how much further are you into this discussion, or do you have more videos that you'll be dropping in the future?
Oh yeah, certainly. I don't have it sketched out enough to know exactly how many videos it will be or how many discussions it will be, but there is enough that, for the foreseeable future, we could do every video or discussion on this. It's just a matter of lining it all up and laying it all out in the right order and all that. But man, it sure seems like this topic is on a meta level as infinite to explore as it is as a subject. Does that make sense?
Sure, it makes sense to me.
Yeah. It goes on for eternity, it seems like, just like the sealing power of Elijah does.
Yeah. Um, well, what's the next part of the conversation? I need a little more. I need something. You got to give me something to hold on to till you drop more.
Some of what we touched on today, I think, is really important, which is recognizing that there's a very real sense in which the ancestors are the gods. Not all of them, um, but those that are part of the Holy Order and who are one with God, um, and are acting on his behalf, sort of as his heavenly body to do his work and will on the earth, they are the gods, right? And so you'll see these kind of patterns show up in uh, culture, like you've pointed out, different cultures. That's not unfounded, and developing an association with them, developing a connection with them, and uh, at least just I mean, you can just start by just learning who they are and recognizing what sacrifices were made to put you exactly in your, you know, in your sphere, in your position, um, given you what you have, the gifts that you have. And if you'll recognize that and receive that love, as part of it is really humbling yourself and recognizing, man, like I am one drop in an ocean here. Um, but it like you have to be humble in order to be filled with meaning. But that love and that sacrifice and that, I mean, it's an overwhelming sort of rainstorm, that will fill you with all the meaning that you could ever want and hope for.
Yeah.
But you have to recognize how small you are, and all that has been given to you.
Yeah. What does Moses say? Uh Now I know that man is nothing.
Mm.
Uh
Thing I never before supposed.
right. Um yeah, there's so many things here. I'm looking forward to seeing more. Um this is a topic that's so well integrated into every other principle of the gospel that I think anybody who's seen your video or who watches this conversation, I think will pick up on it pretty much from here on out, how this plays into everything. So I appreciate you being here and kind of laying this out and being willing to get really really nerdy with me for a little bit.
I love it. Of course. Anytime.